Hello, class. So, today we're going to be going almost to the very end of the Seidman work. We're picking up on chapter 12, where we left off last lecture. And we're looking at how love and marriage became sexualized. Now, keep in mind what we had talked about before, that marriage and love were not originally connected in the 1850s, in the Victorian age. That was something that developed much later on into the early 20th century, particularly in the time period just before the 1950s. You see the beginnings of it, but it was really in the mid-century part where you see love and marriage being sexualized. Well, let's get into the details. Well, not too much into the details because I got a habit of getting lost in them. So, sex was originally seen in the Victorian age. I mean, not originally like, beginning of our species originally, to be tightly controlled by women and as the moral and spiritual center of the family. So, this is also the basis for the logic of blaming the victim in cases when women have been raped, because it's seen as from this past that women are responsible for sex happening or not. And so, if sex occurs and the woman did not want it, that she somehow failed as a woman. Now, this shifts responsibility for male sexuality onto women. Um, and we can see all kinds of interesting and, to our ears today, strange sorts of examples of this. I'll just pick one kind of silly example. In the Victorian age, you see the invention of the tablecloth, also as it was originally called the table skirt. Now, here is the logic behind the cultural logic of the Victorian age behind this. The idea was that men were so sexual and that we would be turned on by any little thing, and women had to control that. And so, since the table in the house would be within the woman's sphere of social power, then she had to control the possibility that men might become sexually aroused because the legs of a table too closely resemble the legs of a woman. Therefore, you see the invention of the tablecloth as a way of hiding the legs of the table so we men don't lose control of our sexualities over furniture. Hey, that's the how the history goes. All right, so first half of the 20th century, sex is upheld as an ideal, and the ideal was also a focus on good sex, whatever that means. Now, for American culture, good sex would be sex where both partners are sexually pleasured. And so you see the first half of the 20th century, the sexual pleasure of women became more important in relationships in a way that it had not been before. Remember, in the Victorian age, the standing medical opinion of the day was that women could not even have orgasms or sexual pleasure. So, with this new focus, we see that sex, love, and marriage begin becoming culturally intertwined with one another. But this has a flip side to it as well. So that women who do not enjoy sex and do not want to have sex necessarily, or not very often, or not as often as her male partner may want to have sex, um, are relabeled as being problematic. Now, in Victorian age, that would just be considered natural and normal for a woman to not want sex. And women wanting sex would be considered abnormal. But by the first half of the 20th century, we end up getting medical terms like frigid. Now, frigid today is highly offensive. and is considered sexist and misogynistic, and it is. Particularly because of the history of where it comes from. Originally, it was considered a medical disease. It was a medical term. And the idea then was that women who do not enjoy sex are diseased and need to see a doctor if they don't want to have as much sex as their male partners. Now, uh, we've talked about crisis of sexuality, crisis of masculinity and gender, and these kinds of things occur every time there's some kind of cultural shift. And so anytime like gender expectations start to change more broadly, the economy changes, so men have to learn social skills and emotional intelligence to at least a functional degree at the very least. We also see, as we've discussed in this class already, that the 1980s and 90s were times when gender and sexuality were changing again and cultural understanding of these things. Now, this ended up triggering again a crisis of sexuality, a crisis of masculinity as well. And there was a push, particularly from the far Christian right, and not to down Christians or people on the right or anything. We're talking about far Christian right, where and as an attempt to bring back Victorian values to American culture. But as Seidman points out, it's almost impossible to go back to some earlier culture, typically because we don't have a good memory of how that culture actually worked. And oftentimes, people who are advocating for these kinds of values are doing so through nostalgic lenses and are not actually calling for a return of Victorian ideals, but a return of Victorian ideals as they best understand them through a nostalgic lens. Um, We also see this time period and even into today, because this is not just in the 80s and 90s. What I'm about to say is also true for today. So we see the defense of the norm of heterosexuality through gender norms. So, for instance, let's take as our example someone who is transgendered. Let's get even more specific and talk about transsexuals. So, transsexuals would be one type of transgender group. And keep in mind, as you should all be aware by now, that the term transgendered is actually a large umbrella term that includes many different understandings of gender, many different gender performances. And so, transsexuals would be one group under the broader umbrella of transgendered. All right. So, that being said, psychology has invented a new mental illness called gender identity disorder, or GID for short. And here, this is particularly dangerous for someone who is transsexual in getting this label attached to them, because will not be allowed to go through any kind of transition. They will not be allowed to take the hormones. Their doctor might deny them the hormones to develop secondary sex characteristics that are in line with their internal sex and gender. Um, and so the idea here is that it eliminates any kind of ambiguity. And so people who are not going to get GID affixed to them as a label have to agree to switch genders um, and pass and not uh, talk about their gender identity as being trans whatsoever, or they will be hit with this medical diagnosis. Now, keep in mind that the majority of people who are transsexual um, do not get surgical reassignment surgery. Most stop at hormone replacement therapy. Now, that's the most common hormone replacement therapy. But we end up seeing that There are a lot of different reasons why people who are transsexual in particular, uh, do not get sexual reassignment surgery. One, it's expensive, and a lot of people just can't afford it. Two, it's not covered by insurance, so that ties in with point one. It's too expensive. And number three, a lot of people who are transsexual do not want the sexual reassignment surgery. Now, a lot do, but it's actually very rare. Well, not rare, I should say uncommon. Rare is a little too strong. To find someone who's transsexual who has gone through the reassignment surgery. Now we see the irony of this time period, this end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st century, where women who are older, who had been socialized to put different meanings on sex and relationships, end up being faced with a changing sexual and gendered culture and trying to adjust to that. Now, back in the 90s, when the little blue pill, Viagra, first hit the market, we saw a corresponding rise in divorces among elderly couples. And so, think about it. If you're an elderly couple, typically if you've had children, grandchildren, you've moved into the grandparent phase of your life. Um, you are focusing on different aspects of the relationship instead of focusing on sex as much. It's still present in the relationship. The elderly have sex too, but sexual drive does decline as we age on average. So we end up seeing with the advent of Viagra, many women were not at all pleased when their husbands were coming home and demanding sex and putting more importance on sex in the relationship than they had previously before the pill. And that ended up increasing the divorce rates, where women did not want to engage in that anymore in the relationship as much. Now, this is also a time period when women's magazines, started targeting older women and basically saying that it's their fault if they do not feel sexual arousal when their men do when they pop a blue pill. And so there are magazines saying it's your duty to have sex even if you don't want to. Well, being forced to have sex when you don't want to is what we call rape, right? All right. We can move quickly through the next few chapters, largely because there's a lot of repeat in terms of the evaluations. So, we're going to be talking about porn, sadomasochism, and prostitution. And the porn chapter and the prostitution chapter can be understood as broken down into a couple of different, or a few different positions. So for porn and prostitution, so this is chapter 13 and chapter 15, you have uh, feminist groups that are divided. All right, so you have the feminist groups who want to legalize prostitution and regulate it, who want to reform pornography and see a lot of potential in pornography. And then you have feminist groups that want to keep prostitution outlawed, but they want the criminal justice system to go after pimps and johns rather than the prostitutes. Um, you see with pornography, there are feminist groups who argue, as you should all be aware from the readings, that porn is the theory and rape is the practice. That pornography focuses too much on male pleasure, and oftentimes in pornography, in heterosexual pornography, when the man reaches climax, that's when the sexual scene stops. And so it teaches or reinforces, I should say, men to focus on their own pleasure. Now, also the amount of violence in mainstream pornography is what they're talking about as well. That oftentimes there's degradation and humiliation of women as a part of the sexual scene. Now, you also see then the conservative perspective. Now, the conservative perspective sees all forms of sex as being a moral and spiritual expression that should only occur within the context of marriage and monogamy, and that any other view on sex or sexuality is to make sex animalistic, to take away this much higher significance of human sexual expression, and to place it down in the same level as all sexual expression of other species included. Then we have the libertarian perspective. Now, the libertarian perspective can kind of be summed up as long as you're not hurting anyone and it's all consensual and it's between adults, then anything goes. Um, it's your personal right to express your sexual desires as you see fit, and as long as it's between adults and consensual, and no one's getting hurt against their will, then have at it. So you see this both in this libertarian perspective, both in pornography and in terms of prostitution. Libertarians are actually fairly consistent in terms of this thinking and apply it across the board to most things. Um, so let's get a little bit more in detail in terms of pornography. Pornography is a $1 trillion industry. It's huge, and it's a multi-billion-dollar industry in America alone. Now, America has about 330 million people living in it. And so if it's generating multi-billions of dollars, then you're looking at something that a lot of people are engaging in. Actually, the majority of people engage it at least sometimes. Um, Now, pornography becomes much more visible in the 60s. Now, pornography has always been around. You can go to the ancient Athens, or you can't go to ancient Athens, but you can go to Athens and look at the ruins, and you can find graffiti that's sexual. The same as if you go to Rome or if you go to Egypt and you look at these ancient civilizations, you'll find pornographic depictions carved into stone, into walls, into columns. And so pornographic imagery has always been a part of human cultures. That's nothing new. I remember watching this documentary that was done by a forensic anthropologist, and they were looking at Ice Age human cultures, and she was talking with this archaeologist, and the forensic archaeologist was British, and she was a woman. The other archaeologist she was talking with was an American man, and you could tell there was a lot of awkwardness in talking about this particular subject. And so the male archaeologist lifts up an item and says, this item has been carbon dated to about 30,000 years ago. And it's a phallic shaped object, and it has all of these different sexual depictions carved into it. It was made from ivory, and the uh, female archaeologist asked the male archaeologist, uh, well, what is this for? And he answered, well, it could have been for ritualistic purposes, but we think it's most likely functional. In other words, he was holding a 30,000-year-old dildo, is what he was saying. So, I mean, this kind of thing is old as humans, all right? So, why did porn become more visible in the 1960s? Camera technology, visual and audio technology ended up allowing for widespread dispersal of pornographic movies. And if you want to go back in time, if you could go back in time and talk to people in the 1960s, say, oh, wait a minute. Wait till you see what the internet brings you. So, now, when it comes to pornography, the overall debate is actually pretty complex. And you'll see this a similar kind of consideration when it comes to questions of prostitution, is how much consent is really a part of pornography. Now, we see today on platforms like Pornhub, X Hamster, these popular porn platforms that anyone, YouPorn is another one that people can go and post to. Um, there's oftentimes obvious videos of women being raped, and that's against the community standards of the platforms. But oftentimes the platforms, they're making money off of them, so they don't take down the videos. Sometimes they will, but it's really difficult, and it takes a lot of outcry for people to affect the companies where they will take it down. And so the question becomes, how much say do women in particular have who have pornographic images placed on these platforms by other people, or women who are filmed without their awareness? There's a wide variety of different examples. Or what about just the need to make money? Say somebody goes to out to LA who's young and impressionable and thinks that, they're going to be the next A-list celebrity star, and then they can't get any roles. Well, they can always make money in pornography. But is that at that point, is are they really choosing to do pornography, or do they simply have no other options? Um, I mean, LA is expensive to live in. Okay. Now, if you will, because of the similarities, I'm going to skip the sadomasochism chapter for just a moment. I'm going to go back to it, but I want to jump ahead to the prostitution chapter. And I want to jump ahead to it because there's so much similarity. Again, we have feminism divided in terms of one groups that argue like Coyote or Call Off Your Old Tired Ethics, that pornography, or not pornography, excuse me, prostitution should be legalized and regulated. Now, there's only one um, place in all of the United States where prostitution is legal, and that is just outside of the city limits of Las Vegas, Nevada. Now, it's not legal within the city limits of Las Vegas, but people can advertise within Las Vegas, and so that leads to the misconception that it's legal within Las Vegas. It's actually not. But if you go out to, say, the Bunny Ranch, which is a legal brothel that uh, where the women who are prostitutes, and I'm sure they probably have some male prostitutes because men are prostitutes too, can be prostitutes. But I don't know that for sure. I've never been to the Bunny Ranch myself. Um, but you see that there's constant STI screening of prostitutes. You also see sex workers are given benefits. They're given the bulk of the pay. Um, and you also see safe sex being enforced. You see people who are there who are working security. So if anyone becomes abusive or violent, they're immediately ejected from the Bunny Ranch. And so, in general, the Bunny Ranch is held up as a possibility, as a model for how the rest of America could legalize and then tax prostitution. Now, keep in mind that policing prostitution costs cities on the city level in terms of pol- police budgets, millions of dollars every year. Whereas that could be turned around into tax revenue, where people are actually, where states and cities are making money, just like what we see with the states that legalized marijuana usage and taxed it and end up operating with surpluses in their budgets. So, you also again see the libertarian argument. Well, as long as the sex work is consensual, then and it's between adults and not hurting anyone. But that's the stickler there, is that not hurting anyone. Is it not hurting anyone when it's illegal? All right. Now, you also then have feminist groups that will oftentimes make kind of uneasy alliances with conservatives in wanting to keep prostitution illegal, but wanting not to punish the sex workers themselves, but wanting to punish the pimps and johns. And this would be where Whisper comes in, or women who are hurt by an institution of sexual exploitation. And so that Whisper is a feminist group just like Coyote, but their goals in terms of sex work are very different. Now, then, we also see there's a Marxist analysis or Marxian analysis of prostitution. Marx wrote that okay, think about it like this. What is labor? The concept of labor itself, particularly in a capitalist context, it is you agreeing to use your body for a specific period of time to do some kind of motion, um, whether it be tied to a computer, a factory line, or a cash register, what have you. You have agreed to do that with your body for a set period of time for money. The only difference between any kind of labor and sex work is the involvement of sex itself. Now, and as we're seeing with the Me Too movement, and we're seeing all of these different sexually abusive work environments being uncovered, we're seeing that sex is actually, for a lot of women, and sexual harassment is an everyday occurrence when women are in the workforce that they have to put up with, and oftentimes with very little recourse whatsoever. Um, all right. So the Marxist analysis would basically argue that it's our culture's negative view of sex in general and judgment of sex and the open expression of sexuality that is the only thing that really distinguishes sex work from any other kind of work. So Marx would say, in effect, that we're all prostitutes. It's just a question of what we're getting paid to do with our bodies. All right. We also see that again, this question of consent. Are women able to consent? Are men who are tied up with prostitution able to consent? Well, there's varying levels of sex work. You can see sex work in terms of what's colloquially called streetwalkers, who are very much abused, who are um, typically held in conditions that are very close to what we would consider enslavement. Oftentimes, this will happen in this way: a pimp will start dating a woman. Oftentimes, the woman comes from poverty, and the pimp offers her a place to stay. So she comes and stays with the pimp, thinking it's her boyfriend. and the pimp is basically tricking her. Then he will do something like, "Oh, why don't we invite my friends over?" And so then the friends will be Johns who will pay the pimp then to have sex, and the women might think they're being sexually adventurous, or if they say no, I'm not going to do that, then the pimp slash boyfriend says, well, I've been covering your rent, I've been covering your food. At this point, you've racked up quite a debt with me. And if you don't do this and you don't end up doing this money or doing this for money, then I'm going to have to demand that you pay me back. Now, here's the thing: is the debt can never be repaid. It doesn't matter how much sex work the woman or man possibly engages in, they're never going to be able to pay down that debt. The debt's always going to be increasing according to the pimp. And so at that point, then, there's really not consent at all. This is a kind of debt bondage that is illegal in the United States. Uh, then we see high-end sex workers who make quite a bit of money, who are able then to even determine whether or not sex is going to occur, like the colloquially called call girls. And so with this group, what the men are paying for is a date, a woman to go with them to whatever they're doing. Now, sex will oftentimes be expected, but a high end, quote unquote, call girl will be able to turn the men down. And if men become abusive, then they'll be banned from using that company again. And so the question of consent depends on which group of sex workers you're referring to. All right. Now let's turn our attention back to sadomasochism for a moment. This will be the last thing we discuss. Um, Now, sadomasochism has become much more a part of Western culture. You see it beginning with pop stars. You see imagery of it with David Bowie, particularly Madonna in the 1980s. A lot of her outfits drew from sadomasochism. But now you're seeing also goths and the kind of neo-punks that descended from the punk movement, emos, skaters, people like that, end up oftentimes incorporating sadomasochistic fashion and wear into just their everyday style. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're into sadomasochism. It just could be that they enjoy the style, and that's a part of the subculture and the youth culture. So, what is sadomasochism? Now, early sexologists describe sadomasochism, or the sadist or the masochist as it breaks down. Sadism would be getting pleasure from causing pain in its most simple definition. Masochism would be getting pleasure from having pain inflicted on you. Now, sexology in the late 1800s ended up characterizing it as a kind of mental illness, and that carried through the 20th century. And it's only been towards the end of the 20th century that you see people starting to question that kind of immediate labeling of sadomasochism as being somehow perverted or a mental illness. Oftentimes, there are sadomasochistic communities. You see this particularly in large cities, but it's even starting to reach rural areas as well. You're seeing it represented rather poorly, but still represented in movies and books like 50 Shades of Grey. Now, people who actually are part of sadomasochistic communities have a lot of problem with 50 Shades of Grey. The main issue is that 50 Shades of Grey um, portrays sadomasochistic relationships as being inherently exploitative. And that's not the case at all. And so typically you have in sadomasochistic communities DOMs and subs, and then you have switches. So DOMs would be those who are dominant or play dominant roles within a sadomasochistic scene. Subs would be the submissives within those roles. Sometimes they use language like master and slave, but because of the problematic association with America's history of slavery, most people in sadomasochistic communities are trying to steer away from that kind of language and use dom and sub more often. And then switcher people who switch would are obviously people who could play the dom role, would play the dom role and enjoy it, or the sub role, either way, and enjoy it. We also see there are gay, lesbian, straight expressions of sadomasochism. Oftentimes in sadomasochistic communities, these kinds of identity divides between different sexual identities break down. And so you'll have people, for instance, who might otherwise identify as being straight, um, who, within the context of sadomasochism, might have engaged in same-sex sexual activity. And the same for someone who might otherwise identify as gay or lesbian, engaging sexually with someone of a different sex or gender, only within the context of sadomasochism, though. It is also sadomasochism is largely about theater. It's theatrical. The language is even theatrical. It's referred to when people are having sex, particularly if you go into like a sadomasochistic club that you can find in most big cities. They'll refer to it as a sexual scene. And these communities are highly ethical, largely because they've had to develop this large degree of ethics because they were targeted by police. So, say that somebody, a neighbor, calls in a noise complaint because somebody's hosting a sadomasochistic party in their home or apartment, and the police come and knock, and then they open the door and police aren't necessarily trained on this kind of thing. They open the door and they see people in cuffs and with gags on and tied up in different positions, and they might very well come to the conclusion that something illegal is occurring. And so sadomasochistic communities end up developing different ethical approaches to it. So, say for example, that a sub uses the safe word. The safe word is supposed to end the sexual scene. So the dom has gone beyond the boundaries of the sub, and the sub invokes the safe word in order to call the sexual scene to a close. If the dom does not respect the safe word, other people in the community will jump in and stop things. And oftentimes, doms who do not respect safe words are pushed out of sadomasochistic communities. Now, we also see, again, with the element of theater and play, is that there are a lot of props, and they're oftentimes talked about as props. And these would be different sex toys and different bondage equipment and stuff, things along these lines. It's actually become a booming business. Now, within sadomasochistic communities, because this has not been just culturally accepted in general, and oftentimes there's still stigma attached to people who are part of sadomasochistic communities. And so we end up seeing that people within sadomasochistic communities will say that there's real intimacy between members, and that yes, humiliation and pain are a part of that, but it's a part of the trust, that knowing that it's not for real. It's not your what defines you as a person. It's just something that you enjoy engaging in particular contexts. And so they liken it to like trust exercises. So you think of it like this: if you're going to let somebody, there must be a high degree of intimacy or at least a high degree of trust. If you're going to let somebody tie you up naked, um, you wouldn't do that with someone you didn't trust, right? However, there's still criticism. Now, while there are sadomasochistic groups that are feminist groups, Samoy, Samois, was a particular lesbian feminist group that was a big part of sadomasochistic scene, and saw sadomasochism as being having a lot of potential in terms of creative sexual expression and opening up creativity and sexual expression. However, there are also feminist groups that are highly critical of sadomasochism and argue that because our culture is patriarchal, that all dominant positions are automatically thought of as being masculine. And so, even when a woman is entering the dom position or the dom role within a sexual scene, oftentimes masculinist values are still being replicated. For instance, the black leather and the um, stiletto boots and all of these kinds of things that are geared towards a particular heterosexual masculine gaze on the female body. And so, and then women who engage in the dom role are expected to, be tough and strong and strict and disciplined. And these are all things that within our patriarchal culture are associated with masculinity. And so, feminists who are critical of sadomasochism argue that it's a replication of heterosexual masculinist values, even if you are doing it within the context of, say, lesbian groups, or whether you're doing it with people across sexual identities, that it's still a replication then of masculinist values. All right. So I'm going to stop there, and I will do a video on chapter 16 that will be posted shortly. And if anyone has any questions or anything, make sure to email me. Stay safe and be well.